Hey heroes, and welcome to another uncanny episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an event of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. From the day he was born in the port city of Agarashima, the life of Shiro Yoshida was one of privilege, tragedy, and generational trauma. In some ways, his story begins years before his birth with the atomic bombing of Japan at the end of World War II. His grandfather survived the destruction of Nagasaki but was stricken with radiation poisoning that eventually claimed his life. His mother, who grew up in Hiroshima, subsequently suffered a similar malady and developed terminal cancer that weakened her body, and she ultimately died in childbirth. On the other hand, Shiro's father, Saburo Yoshida, was a member of a powerful and influential family, Clan Yashida. Now, I will note that in relation to these characters, the names Yoshida and Yashida are sometimes used interchangeably, although Shiro is more often referred to as Yoshida, whereas his cousin Mariko and the clan itself are typically referred to as Yashida. That aside, Shiro's father, Saburo, was also one of Japan's top diplomats, and spent much of his time overseas on business. As such, Shiro was mostly raised by his uncle Tomo, a Japanese nationalist who resented the United States. Tomo Yoshida harshly trained Shiro in martial arts and the ways of Bushido, all the while indoctrinating the boy into his way of thinking. Tomo also began to suspect his nephew's mutant nature even before his powers emerged, and when Shiro was a teenager, Tomo took him to visit a preserved ruin in Hiroshima, and had Shiro dig his hands into the soil. Seemingly as a result of this, Shiro's latent abilities manifested for the first time, granting him the power to absorb solar radiation and generate superheated nuclear plasma. Fortunately for him, he also automatically projected a psionic force field that protected himself from the negative effects of his own powers. After that, Shiro spent the next several years honing these abilities under his uncle's tutelage, and he eventually learned to use the heat generated by his body to fly. Intending on using him as a weapon against the West, Tomo Yoshida clad his nephew in a costume that was evocative of the Japanese rising sun flag, and dubbed him Taiyo Kaji, or as he became known in English, Sunfyre. I will note that at some point in the midst of all of this, Saburo Yoshida remarried and had a daughter named Leyu, who eventually grew up and developed similar mutant abilities, although the details of her upbringing have not been documented. In the meantime, Tomo Yoshida sought to obtain the secrets of the adamantium bonding process developed by Kenji Oyama, aka Lord Darkwind. Tomo sent Sunpyre to steal this data from Oyama's research facility in Yokohama, and hired 3 other mutants to accompany him: Mystique, Rogue, and Blind Spot. Rogue and Sunpyre battled Darkwind's ninjas while others attempted to complete the job, but Oyama ultimately escaped with his hard drives before anyone else could claim them. I should note, though, that sometime later, to protect herself from retaliation, Blind Spot used her memory-altering powers to erase any knowledge of this attempted raid from the minds of all those involved. In any event, while that job had ended in failure, Shiro nonetheless proved the efficacy of his abilities, and both he and Tomo subsequently accompanied Saburo on a trip to the United States, where Saburo unveiled a new monument at UN Plaza in New York. In his masked identity of Sunpyre, Shiro attacked, destroying the statue and declaring Saburo a traitor to Japan, but was ultimately driven off by 3 X-Men: Iceman, Beast, and Angel. Shiro and Tomo then followed the Japanese delegation to Washington and intended on launching an attack on the Capitol building. However, Saburo learned of his son's dual identity, much to his shame and disappointment. The X-Men also attempted to intervene, and while Sunfire's powers proved formidable, he ceased his attack when his father put himself between him and his target. Tomo, however, was so convinced of his cause that he fatally shot his own brother in cold blood, expecting Sunfire to resume his assault. But Shido was so enraged by this that he struck Tomo down, killing him instantly. Shido then rushed to his father's side, and with his dying breath, Saburo Yoshida asked his son to strive for peace. In the wake of this incident, Sunfire blamed himself for his father's death, but masked his self-hatred behind a standoffish, self-important facade. After being deported back to Japan, he laid low in the slums of Tokyo for a time, before he was approached by another Japanese mutant, Katsuo Sasaki. As a young man in the mid-1940s, Sasaki was apprenticed to Japanese scientists in a secret underground laboratory on the Pacific island of Krakinowa. When Japan formally surrendered at the end of World War II, this facility was shut down, but Sasaki was inadvertently left behind. He was plunged into total darkness as power to the base was cut off, but his eyes eventually adjusted, and he survived on stored rations and bottled water. He eventually found a way out that wasn't sealed off and escaped the facility. However, by that point his eyes had become so sensitive that the light of the midday sun rendered him permanently blind. He was taken in and cared for by the indigenous population of Krakinowa, and soon discovered that his mutant powers compensated for his blindness, allowing him to mentally perceive the world around him by seeing through the eyes of others. Over the following years, he eventually manipulated the people of Krakinowa into making him their high priest, and used them to begin construction of a sprawling headquarters from which he could plot his vengeance. Intending on striking out against the United States, Katsuo Sasaki began calling himself the Dragon-Lord, and left the island in search of a worthy ally, recruiting Sunfire by claiming that he wished to restore and elevate Japan as a major world power. Thinking of himself as the Dragon-Lord's atomic samurai, Sunfire accepted a mission to capture an American vessel that was transporting a powerful herbicide, with which they could blackmail the world. However, his efforts were interrupted by the Atlantean mutant Namor, the Sub-Mariner. Of course, Namor famously fought alongside the Allied forces during World War II, and notably participated in battles against Japan in the Pacific Theater, and so Sunfire was more than willing to test his mettle against such a foe. However, during this conflict, he inadvertently damaged the vessel that he sought to capture, threatening to spill the powerful defoliant within. Learning from Namor that such a disaster would have devastating environmental consequences on the entire planet, Sunfire had no choice but to help the Submariner contain the situation and prevent the chemicals from dispersing into the ocean. Having no taste for pointless slaughter, Sunfire also helped rescue American seamen who had fallen into the water. In the end, Sunfire realized that the so-called Dragon-Lord of Krakinowa had only been using him as a pawn in his own schemes for global domination, and Shido turned against him. After his defeat, Shido dropped the would-be conqueror onto an American military base, and Katsuo Sasaki hasn't been seen since. Despite all of that, Sunfire still sought to continue his fight with Namor. However, the Submariner had no interest in a battle that he viewed as pointless, and escaped. Those two later met again when both Namor and Captain America came to Osaka to obtain a piece of an arcane artifact called the Evil Eye. Okay, long story short, that was part of a larger conflict between the Avengers and the Defenders, in which the trickster god Loki and the Dark Dimensions ruler Dormammu had manipulated the two teams into hunting for the fragments of the Evil Eye. Captain America and Namor both came to Japan in search of one piece. However, their battle was interrupted by Sunfire, who warned them to respect his nation's boundaries. In this instance, however, Namor simply overpowered and defeated his younger foe, and subsequently joined forces with his old ally, Captain America, to determine the true cause of the war between their two teams. But that's a story for another time. Getting back to the topic at hand, with his reputation sullied by ignominious exploits, Sunpyre sought to restore his honor by traveling to Southeast Asia and aiding in reconstruction efforts in the closing days of a certain international conflict. As some of you can probably guess, this is one of those stories in which the original telling took place in Vietnam, but because of the sliding time scale, in modern continuity the conflict in question would be the Sin-Cong War, which began in the neighboring nation of Sin-Cong. In any event, Iron Man was also in the area at the time searching for a missing POW. Annoyed by the American hero's refusal to listen to his commands, a local military official asked Sunpyre to eliminate Iron Man, and Shido agreed, mostly because he viewed Tony Stark as a major rival to Japanese businesses. However, this conflict caught the attention of the notorious Chinese crime lord, the Mandarin, who interrupted the battle by teleporting Sunpyre to his underwater base. Now, at the time, the Mandarin's mind had been transferred into the body of the former Soviet agent the Unicorn, but he was able to force Shido to provide his machines with enough power to undo this process and restore his original body. Despite their earlier conflict, Sunpyre was ultimately rescued by Iron Man, and the two subsequently joined forces, combining their powers to defeat the Mandarin's servant, the giant alien robot Ultimo. In the end, Iron Man and Sunpyre parted ways as allies, at least for the moment, leaving Shido to ruminate on his preconceptions. He subsequently returned to Japan and later was approached by the X-Men's founder, Professor Charles Xavier. With most of the original X-Men having been taken captive by the living island Krakoa, Xavier was quickly assembling a new team to mount a rescue mission, and while he was quick to loudly announce his grievances with the situation, Sunpyre nonetheless lent them his aid. During this time, Shido received from Xavier a version of his costume made from unstable molecules, the same adaptive material used by the Fantastic Four. In the end, this rescue mission was successful, however, Sunpyre left as soon as it was over, declining Xavier's offer to become a permanent member of the team. He later launched an impulsive attack on Stark International after Tony Stark had been wrongly accused of bribing Japanese officials, but this time Sunpyre was subdued by his erstwhile ally Iron Man. After that, there was an incident in which the international arms dealer Moses Magnum threatened to use his seismic superpowers to sink all of Japan, unless they handed control of the nation over to him. To demonstrate his ability to carry out this threat, Magnum launched an attack on the city of Agarashima, where Clan Yashida's ancestral mansion was located. As a member of the clan, Shido met with Japanese officials to discuss the situation, along with the daughters of the Dragon, Misty Knight, and Colleen Wing, the latter of which had Japanese ancestry on her mother's side and was related to the head of the Secret Service. In the midst of this, the X-Men coincidentally arrived, seeking a way home after an unrelated adventure in the Antarctic, and they subsequently helped Sunpyre defend Yashida Mansion from Magnum's Mandroids. As such, the Prime Minister ordered Sunpyre to work with the X-Men in opposing Moses Magnum, and in the end the heroes were victorious. As a result, the X-Men earned Sunpyre's gratitude and to some degree his respect, and they parted ways as friends. Although it was also in the midst of this trip to Japan that Wolverine first met Shido's cousin, Mariko Yashida, and a romance began to blossom between them, much to Sunpyre's annoyance. In the meantime, Sunpyre was among the heroes selected to participate in a contest of champions between the Elder of the Universe, known as the Grand Master, and the Cosmic Abstract Death, who coerced the heroes into participating by holding the rest of humanity hostage. Chosen by Death, Shido Yoshida was forced to fight on her behalf alongside Iron Fist and the Invisible Woman in a battle against Daredevil, the Russian mutant Dark Star, and the Aboriginal Australian mystic Talisman, not to be confused with the Canadian hero of the same name. Competing in a snowstorm so cold that even Sunfyre felt the chill, each team was tasked with retrieving a golden relic before the other. However, Shido had his hands full against Darkstar's dark force-powered abilities, and in the end the Grandmaster's team won that round of the contest. After that whole situation, Wolverine got into a conflict with Mariko Yashida's father, a notorious crime lord named Lord Shingen Harada. When this battle ended with Shingen's death, Mariko assumed control of Clan Yashida. And so later, when the X-Men returned from the Beyonders battle world in the wake of the first secret war and were followed by an alien dragon, later named Puff, that grew to gargantuan proportions due to an energy fluctuation in the teleportation and started making its way towards Tokyo, Mariko commanded her cousin to aid the X-Men, and Sunfyre had no choice but to obey. After that battle, Sunfyre effectively operated as Japan's de facto superhero. He defeated the bank-robbing American criminal Jackson Day, aka the Corruptor, thwarted the schemes of Dr. Kishi Otomosha, aka Deadline, by destroying his solar-powered Doomsday device, teamed up with the cyborg vigilante Michael Collins, aka Deathlock, to prevent a madman named Yoritomo from triggering another war between Japan and the West, and joined forces with Cable's New Mutants team in a battle against the Mutant Liberation Front, a militant terrorist group assembled by Cable's evil clone Strife, which included Japanese mutants Haruo Tsurayaba, aka Kamikaze, and June Tenta, aka Sumo, as well as a woman named Tamara Kurtz, aka Dragoness, whose ancestors had also been exposed to radioactive fallout in Hiroshima. Sunfyre was subsequently brainwashed by the mad scientist Dr. Demonicus and forced to join his Pacific Overlords, a group otherwise composed mostly of humans that Demonicus himself had mutated. Sunfyre was sent to launch an attack on Hawaii's Pearl Harbor alongside a fire-manipulating mutate named Michi Sasaki, who had been hypnotized by Demonicus into impersonating the oceanic volcano goddess Pele. However, the West Coast Avengers intervened, snapping Shido out of his brainwashing, and Sunfyre ultimately helped the heroes defeat Dr. Demonicus and the Pacific Overlords. Returning to Japan, Sunfyre briefly clashed with the immortal warrior Black Axe before the two joined forces in a battle against the notorious ninja death cult known as the Hand. The Japanese government subsequently provided Shido with a new armored costume designed to enhance his abilities and sent him to assist a scientific expedition on Sakhalin Island. When this resulted in the accidental opening of an interdimensional void that unleashed a legion of armored warriors, the X-Men answered the expedition's distress signal and came to Sunfyre's aid. In the ensuing conflict, they wound up trapped in that other dimension for a time, but ultimately succeeded in escaping and sealing the breach once again. When Wolverine, Jubilee, and Gambit subsequently clashed with Hand ninjas in Tokyo, Sunfyre came to their aid in turn. However, this was in the midst of a larger conflict between Clan Yashida and a faction of the Hand controlled by the notorious Yakuza member Matsuo Tsurayaba. In the end, Tsurayaba ensured that Mariko Yashida was fatally poisoned with Fugu toxin, and in the wake of her death, control of the clan fell to her half-brother, Kenichiro Harada, better known as the Silver Samurai. Shido subsequently clashed with Namor yet again while investigating Atlantean attacks on Japanese whaling vessels, but ultimately learned that the true culprit was the undersea barbarian Atuma, and in the end Namor and Sunfyre worked together to rescue whalers who had been dropped into the water. Not too long after that, when Magneto sent an enormous electromagnetic pulse across the entire planet, Sunfire's powers were affected, causing them to briefly flare out of control. He was fortunately flying high enough above Tokyo at the time that nobody was seriously injured by the eruption of plasma energy. However, the Japanese government decided to play things safe by imprisoning and quarantining Shido Yoshida. Sometime later, he was freed by Wolverine and the Silver Samurai, and the three worked together to stop the enormous mech, Red Ronin, when the Hand attempted to gain control over it. For those unfamiliar, the Red Ronin was originally designed years earlier by Dr. Yuriko Takiguchi and built at Stark International in America as a safeguard against the infamous kaiju Godzilla. In any event, during his fight with the giant robot, Sunfire's powers briefly flared out of control again. Rather than let him be imprisoned, Wolverine sent Shido to Canada in the hopes that his old allies, James and Heather Hudson, could help him. However, after meeting with Canada's Department H, Shido was instead entrusted to the care of the amoral scientist Horatio Huxley and his Helios project. Purporting to help him, Huxley exposed Sunfire to a radioactive inhibitor called Zero Fluid, which was originally developed by a man named Philip Hart to stabilize his son, Jack's half-alien physiology, but ultimately catalyzed Jack's transformation into the superhuman Jack of Hearts. In Sunfire's case, this caused him to be charged with biokinetic energy that conflicted with his natural bioatomic energy, and Huxley explained this away by falsely claiming that he had contracted radiation poisoning from his own mutant powers. Over time, this caused a black rash to begin spreading over half of his body. He returned to Japan to die in his own homeland, but soon afterwards was asked by the Silver Samurai to join their country's newly created superhero team, Big Hero 6. While he refused to become a full-fledged member of the team, he did aid them in a battle against the Everwraith, a ghostly entity composed of vengeful spirits from those who had died in the bombing of Hiroshima. Meanwhile, the boy genius Hiro Takachiho deduced the true cause of Sunfire's increasingly severe malady and had him eject the excess zero energy in his body to defeat the Everwraith, effectively killing two birds with one proverbial stone. Sunfire subsequently returned to Canada seeking revenge on Huxley, but when Japan was attacked by a gigantic creature called X the Unknowable, Shido chose to prioritize saving his countrymen over revenge and abandoned his vendetta. Sometime after that conflict, the remaining zero fluid in his system was successfully purged from his body, and he ultimately made a full recovery, donning a version of his classic costume and resuming his superhero career by working for the Japanese intelligence agency Yakiba, or Cutting Edge. In one mission, he investigated a series of infiltrations of top-secret military installations which seemed to be carried out by the shapeshifter Mystique, and ultimately joined forces with her foster daughter, Rogue, to hunt down the true culprits, which eventually turned out to be a group of alien Skrulls working for the ancient mutant Apocalypse. These incursions were actually part of a larger scheme by Apocalypse to obtain godlike power by siphoning the energy-manipulating abilities of 12 specific mutants, one of which was Sunfire. But in the end, the X-Men thwarted this plan and defeated Apocalypse. Returning to Japan, Sunfire continued doing missions for the Yakiba, including one in which he joined forces with several American heroes to prevent the mystical city of Kunlun from permanently merging with Tokyo. Meanwhile, when the X-Men were bolstering their forces in preparation for an impending conflict with Magneto, they contacted Sunfire and asked him to join them. And while Shido had no intention of answering this summons, his teenage half-sister, Leyu, decided to go in his stead, donning a similar costume and dubbing herself Sunpyre. She later joined Banshee's paramilitary group X-Corps, where she primarily worked as a researcher. However, her career came to a tragically swift end when she was murdered by Mystique. Shido Yoshida, meanwhile, continued to have adventures as Sunfire both at home and abroad, which we wouldn't have time to go into detail about here. In one incident, he and Rogue battled Lord Darkwind's cyborg daughter, Lady Deathstrike, who slashed off Sunfire's legs above the knee. His body was later healed when Apocalypse transformed him into his Horseman Famine, and he subsequently regained his sense of self when Emma Frost freed him from Apocalypse's control. Retaining his powers after M-Day, he aided the X-Men in subsequent conflicts and even fought alongside Captain America's Avengers Unity Division. During the Krakoa era, when Xavier made peace with the Living Island and used it as the location to establish a mutant nation, Sunfyre joined them there and was even elected onto the primary X-Men team during the first annual Krakoan Hellfire Gala. In the end, while Yoshida initially rode the line between hero and villain, despite his standoffish attitude, he has more often than not proved his capacity for heroism and a willingness to fight for the greater good, all while maintaining a strong sense of pride in his cultural and national heritage. Alright heroes, that's all I've got for you this week, but thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in the special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!